Hi, my name is Melissa Kobos. I'm an Abbott registered EEG technologist with certification in long-term monitoring and assistant professor of neurodiagnostic technology. In this video, we'll be taking a look at benign patterns that are seen in the posterior region.
We have several sharp and slow patterns that can show up in the posterior regions, especially in children and adolescents. This is our first example. So what you see in the posterior regions is some high voltage delta, but there's some overriding faster alpha frequency activity on top of it. Something else we notice, if we first orient ourselves to the montage, we have a left temporal chain over right temporal chain, left parasagittal over right parasagittal, and vertex at the bottom. The eyes are open for this portion of the page, and then about here, the patient's eyes close. And this is where we see this high voltage delta pop up. So that's probably the most important characteristic that we can recognize here is that this attenuates with opening, just like the posterior dominant rhythm. Any idea what this is? Posterior slow waves of youth. Posterior slow waves of youth are going to be maximum in the age range of 8 to 14 years. You'll have usually delta, sometimes theta, but usually delta in the occipital channels with an overriding faster frequency. That's an important characteristic to remember because abnormal posterior delta won't have the overriding faster frequency usually. This can be seen in children and adolescents, and it has the same reactivity as the PDR. So as the patient gets drowsy and goes to sleep, it will attenuate along with the PDR. And when the patient's eyes are open, it will also attenuate. Here's another example. In this page, the patient's eyes are closed the entire time. We have high voltage delta with overriding alpha for the majority of the page. But as you can see, the amplitude is not constant. Sometimes it kind of comes and goes a bit. All right, this is our next benign pattern. And this montage is left hemisphere over right hemisphere with a vertex in the middle. So we're moving across the head from left to right. What we see in the occipital channels here is some really sharp waveforms. They're frequent and they have a triangular morphology. Something we notice is that the patient is awake. We know this because there's a lot of muscle and there's a lot of eye movement, very frequent eye movement. And it's almost an erratic eye movement, including lots of short lateral eye movements. So the patient is doing something visually. Any ideas what this is? The triangular morphology and the fact that the patient is awake and having eye movement can possibly give this one away. This is lambda. The lambda is sharp triangular waves with a positive polarity that are seen in the occipital channels when a patient is reading or watching TV or doing something that would cause similar eye movements. If you wanted to prove that it's lambda, not that it's necessary, you could have the patient stop looking at what they're looking at. You could block their visual input, say by putting a blank piece of paper in front of them, and then you would see that lambda attenuate. Let's look at our next one. This is somewhat similar. We have the same montage going left to right, left hemisphere over the vertex and then the right hemisphere. And in the posterior channels, we see some sharp, again, triangular waveforms that are pretty frequent. Now, in this case, if we notice the state of the patient, while this looks like lambda, we know it's not lambda because the patient is not awake. At the end of this page, we see a big biphasic delta wave that's pretty diffuse, but maximum in the frontal-fronto-central regions. This is a K complex. And overall, the EEG is low voltage. There's no muscle or eye movement of any kind. So the patient is asleep here, and these are post. So post are positive occipital sharp transients of sleep. These are bilateral sharp triangular waveforms with a positive polarity in the occipital channels. They look very similar to lambda, but these are going to be seen starting in stage 1 and will continue into stage 2 sleep. Here's our next one. Now, this montage is a bit strange because we have the right temporal region over the left temporal region, and then right central over left central, central temporal. So this is not a standard montage by ACNS guidelines, and I'll point out that it actually breaks with their requirement that we put left hemisphere over right hemisphere. But what we see here is in this channel with T602, there's some pretty high amplitude delta activity, but it has a quite triangular morphology, and we also see it in the T501 channel. It has a little bit of a shifting asymmetry. It's a little bit higher amplitude on the right when it occurs here. It's a little bit higher amplitude on the left when it occurs here. One thing we notice is that it really has that triangular morphology. So any guesses what this is? So the patient's asleep, so we know that this is not posterior slow waves of youth. These are Cone waves. So cone waves have gone by other names, although I haven't personally heard these used. They can be called cone-shaped waves, occipital waves, O waves, or slow lambdoids of youth. These also have a triangular morphology, which seems to be a popular morphology for the posterior area. They're monophasic or diphasic. They have a duration over a quarter of a second and can be medium to high amplitude. We're going to see these in patients that are between about 6 months to 3 years of age mostly, and they're only seen during non-REM sleep. So that could be something that could potentially help you to rule it out as something that's not abnormal. You will not see it in wakefulness. It will be exclusive to non-REM sleep. Here's another example of cone waves. So we have these triangular slow waves at O1 and O2 that last 400 milliseconds or so, 250 milliseconds. In this one, they're higher amplitude than the surrounding background activity, and they have that really triangular shape and a little bit longer duration than some of the surrounding waveforms. So that helps them stand out as cone waves. And our last example here, we've got a nice cone wave right there. Okay, on this one, the montage labels are a little bit cut off, but we have left temporal over right temporal, and then left parasagittal over right parasagittal, and the vertex at the bottom. And what we see on this page is some really high amplitudes theta. And in a lot of places, this seems to have a little bit of a notched morphology. If you look at this waveform right here, for example, it's notched on the top. This one is a little bit notched. Both of these are. So there's this notching going on. Notching is something that happens when you have a fundamental frequency interacting with another frequency, especially its harmonic or subharmonic. And that's exactly what's going on here. Our posterior dominant rhythm is mixing in with a subharmonic, and this is subharmonic alpha. Something else we notice, similar to posterior slow waves of youth, is that when the patient opens their eyes here, the subharmonic alpha attenuates along with the posterior dominant rhythm. It kind of is the posterior dominant rhythm, right? So it attenuates with eye opening, just like posterior slow waves of youth. So this is known also as slow alpha variant. It has a notched appearance. That doesn't mean that every single waveform will be notched, but you'll generally see a notching. It's half the frequency of the ongoing background rhythm. It can be persistent or asymmetric. And here's another example. So here we see this slow alpha variant pop up. This is a really nice example to point to here because each of these waveforms is notched on the top. So if we were to count each of the little waves on the top, we would have 8 hertz. But if we count these larger theta waves on the bottom, we have 4 hertz, exactly half the frequency of the ongoing posterior dominant rhythm. And that's what we see with subharmonic alpha. So attenuation properties will be the same as a posterior dominant rhythm. This will go away as the patient gets drowsy and will go away with eye opening as well. Okay, well, I hope you found that helpful for benign patterns in the posterior region. We'll be releasing some videos on benign patterns in other areas like the temporal region, also some diffuse patterns and central patterns. So keep an eye out for other educational content from LASET. And if you are interested in looking up the sources of any of those samples that I showed, some of those were my own and some came from these sources here. Until next time.